Hi guys, my name is Danae Brazil and today we're here to talk about my F1 driver ratings for the Dutch Grand Prix, which ended up being a very chaotic race despite, I thought after the sprint we were having an absolutely boring, borderline unwatchable race because the sprint was boring and unwatchable to be honest, but we ended up having a lot go on, so we have a lot to talk about and I will get straight into it. Starting with Aston Martin and Fernando Alonso, who I'm giving a 9.5 out of 10. I can't believe I can give Alonso a rating this high finally this season. Aston Martin have finally managed to give their drivers a car that they can do something with, which is great to see, and Fernando Alonso did a phenomenal job this weekend. Starting with the sprint qualifying, he qualified dead last of no fault of his own. There were issues with the car, and then he ended it in 18th. That's fine. That's kind of where I expected the Aston Martin to be, and so after that kind of thought we wouldn't have much to talk about. But then in the race, Fernando Alonso did an incredible job. He again started 18th. Qualifying wasn't great, but in the race, Alonso made the one-stop work, which I think he's one of very few drivers that did the one-stop, and he managed to take some points home for Aston Martin, put together a really, really good race. I'm very happy to see this from him. Maybe a 9.5 is a little high of a rating from me, but I'm just so happy to see him up here, and I do think it was a phenomenal drive, so it's very unlikely I change that, so. Moving on to Lance Stroll, who I'm giving the usual Aston Martin 5 out of 10. In the sprint, qualified 19th, finished 17th. That's kind of where I expect that car to be. And in the main race, qualified 19th and didn't finish. It was just fine from Lance. He showed up and drove the car. That's really about all I can say about his weekend, so we'll just move on. Next up is Cadillac. I'm going to start with Valtteri Bottas, who I'm giving a 5 out of 10 as well. Now that the Aston Martin has been upgraded, Cadillac are very firmly the worst team on the grid now, which is kind of what we expected coming into the season. The Aston Martin being so bad has kind of helped Cadillac somewhat. And yeah, for Valtteri, it was a pretty average weekend. Qualified 20th, finished 19th in the sprint, and then in the main race, qualified 21st and didn't finish. Yeah, it was fine. It's the very usual kind of Cadillac weekend that we've come to expect from them. And yeah, Valtteri didn't do anything necessarily wrong, but I can't say he did anything really worth talking about. Next up, we have Sergio Perez, who I'm also giving a 5 out of 10. You know, some things have changed after the summer break, but certainly not my Cadillac driver ratings. In the sprint, qualified 21st, finished there. In the main race, qualified 22nd, finished 15th. Really, the 15th looks more positive than it is. He just benefited from several cars not finishing the race. But yeah, it was a fine drive from Perez. He was slower than Valtteri in qualifying pretty consistently this weekend, so that isn't ideal for him, but yeah, otherwise there's very little to talk about. Moving on to Williams, I'm going to start with Carlos Sainz, who I'm giving a 4 out of 10. This is second race in a row that I'm giving Carlos Sainz a low grade because his driving this weekend was just really unimpressive, and then he drove into his teammate. So starting with the sprint, qualified 18th, finished 20th. I don't expect a lot from the Williams car at this point. I do think the package they have is not very good at all. But he was still way down Albon throughout qualifying. And then in the main race, qualified 17th, finished 16th. Again, behind Albon in qualifying. And then he proceeded to drive into his teammate Alex Albon, which caused Albon to DNF, which is so frustrating too because, as we'll get onto in a minute, I actually do think Alex was driving a pretty good race, and Carlos just completely ruined that. Yet again, just complete unawareness from Carlos Sainz in the car, and for a driver who I think we all rate as highly as we do Carlos Sainz. I just am getting quite sick of these incidents from him where he is just so unaware behind the car and ends up colliding with other people. Next up is Alex Albon, who I'm giving a 6 out of 10. In the sprint, qualified 16th, finished 16th, and then in the main race, qualified 16th and did not finish, of no fault of his own. So I think Alex did a very good job this weekend, considering again the state of the Williams car. Consistently better than Carlos Sainz throughout every session, which we haven't seen much of this season, but I'm glad to see that Alex Albon is in better form, seemingly, after the summer break. And then, yeah, he was driving a pretty decent race, and then, unfortunately for him, his teammate decided to just fucking steamroll him, so really unfortunate end to what I think was a pretty good weekend otherwise for Alex Albon. Next up we have Alpine. I'm going to start with Franco Colapinto. I'm giving a 5.5 out of 10. In the sprint he qualified 13th, finished 12th, and then in the main race he qualified 14th and finished 14th. So far that race result really doesn't say any of what happened to Franco during this race. He was plagued with penalties. He leaves this race with 3 additional penalty points on his license, which is not good. I think some of it's fair, some of it isn't. I understand he got given the penalty for overtaking under the yellow flags, but from when I watched the onboard, it didn't really look as much like he was trying to overtake, but more was trying to avoid a collision. Ended up overtaking. I think it's either Lindblad or Sonoda, but really unfortunate. I don't know how I feel about that one. Like, I agree we should not be overtaking under yellow flags, but it did feel more like he was taking avoiding action than purposefully overtaking. But yeah, a race that was really unfortunate for Franco. I actually think, considering that he did not have the upgrades this weekend that his teammate has, he is getting them in Monza. I actually think Franco kept up pretty well with Gasly because, yeah, Gasly had several upgrades on his Alpine, but Franco was never too far off, I think, considering that disparity between their cars this weekend. And so I think his driving itself was not bad at all. I just think he got a bit unlucky and then did some things wrong. I don't know. I feel like we did not get given enough information about all of his penalties, so maybe with more information I'd rate him lower, but as of right now I think it was a pretty decent weekend, and so I think a 5.5 is pretty fair. Next up we have Pierre Gasly, who I'm going to give a 7.5 out of 10. He qualified 8th in the sprint and finished 8th in the sprint as well, and then in the main race qualified 11th, finished 10th. I think this was a good drive from Pierre. I think it was, yeah, pretty decently well done. I think the Alpine upgrades are clearly working. I think he was more firmly in the midfield pack again because it did feel like they were starting to fall away a little bit from the points positions. So I'm glad to see that those upgrades are working. I will say in the middle stint, I think Gasly got quite unlucky / made some poor kind of defensive and overtaking choices that led to him really getting swallowed up by a lot of the pack. And I do think that really harmed him going forward. But otherwise, I think it was a pretty decent drive. You know, he takes home a point. Actually, he takes home 2 points because he also got a point in the sprint. So yeah, I think it was a fine weekend for Pierre. Nothing too special, but I think, yeah, a decent enough job. Next up we have Audi. I'm going to start with Nico Hülkenberg, who I'm giving an 8 out of 10. He qualified 14th in the sprint and then was not classified because he finished so many laps down. And then in the main race qualified 13th, finished 8th. I think this was a very good drive from Nico. We're essentially, the sprint I'm barely taking into this one because I don't think there was much to say about it. I do think he was way off his teammate in sprint qualifying, but other than that, I don't have like a ton to say. Actually, even in main qualifying, Nico was quite far off Gabby, and that is kind of the reason why his overall grade isn't higher, because I think in the race, Nico was fantastic. First of all, him managing to avoid hitting Gabby when he spun out was very impressive. That could have been a horrific crash if Nico had T-boned him there. I think that was a very, very good reaction from him. And then the rest of the race, he was so far clear of the rest of the midfield by the end. He was easily the best of that pack. Just really opportunistic, some really good overtakes in there, and then just really utilised the pace of that Audi. Next up is Gabriel Bortoleto, who I'm giving a 5 out of 10. In the sprint, he qualified 9th and finished 9th, and then in the main race, he qualified 9th, finished 13th, which really does not illustrate the full story of Gabby's weekend, I think. Really good job in the sprint. Unfortunate to be one position away from the points, because I do think that was a really good sprint quali and then kept it tidy in the sprint. And then in the main race, again, a really good qualifying, I think, putting that Audi kind of where I think it should be based on kind of the pace we saw this weekend. But then, spun out directly behind Max Verstappen spinning out in the opening lap of the race. Luckily for Gabby, he did not have quite the same crash as Max and managed to spin out without hitting the wall and without being collected by any of the other cars. However, that big spin did really undo a lot of his good work from qualifying. And I do think him finishing up in 13th really flatters him and is again more due to DNFs happening ahead of him than him actually having a good race, because more than anything this was just a recovery drive for Gabby, and he really just ruined his race with a mistake, and I think a 5 is pretty fair for that, because otherwise I think his pace was quite good. Next up we have the V-Carbs. I'm going to start with Yuki Tsunoda, who I am giving an 8 out of 10. I think Yuki Tsunoda did a great job this weekend, especially considering he has been thrown into this regulation of car for the first time. Obviously he's driven it on the simulator before, but I think he did a phenomenal job considering he had only had 1 hour of practice before any competitive sessions, and he's never driven these cars before, and I think he did a great job. So, in the sprint, he qualified 12th, finished 13th. I think there's nothing to be mad about, considering, again, he'd only spent an hour in the car before sprint quali, so I think to put it up in 12th, not that far off of Arvid Lindblad, I think is a very good job. And then, 13th in the sprint is nothing to be too upset about. And then in the main race, qualified 12th, finished 11th. I'm gutted that he didn't manage to make it into the points, like he was so close, but I think a really good drive from Yuki. That overtake on Pierre Gasly was phenomenal. I think some of the best wheel-to-wheel that we've seen from Yuki, maybe ever, or at least certainly in a very long time. And I hope that other teams maybe look to give him a seat next year, but if not, if this is the last race we get to see of Yuki Tsunoda, I will say that it's a really nice note to end his F1 career on, if this is it, versus it being that awful Red Bull stint he had last year. If this is the memory we're left with of Yuki Tsunoda in F1, I think that is only positive. And I'm really glad that we got to see him, I think, have a really good time in the car and put together a really good race weekend. Next up we have Arvid Lindblad. I'm giving a 7 out of 10. He qualified 10th in the sprint, finished 10th. And then in the main race, qualified 10th, finished 12th. Again, another one who had their race ruined by penalties, drive-through penalty, absolutely obliterated Arvid's chances at points. So I think to finish up in 12th is not bad, but again, you make the mistake, you get the punishment, and it kind of ruins his weekend. I also do think that I expected the V-Carb to be a little faster. I think qualifying at 10th certainly isn't bad, obviously, but I kind of assumed he would be up a little higher, maybe up in 9th instead, maybe even fighting kind of Lawson over 8th, just because of Liam being put in the Red Bull for the first time. But it's a fine weekend from Arvid Lindblad, but I will say I do think Yuki Tsunoda having such an easy time, as much as he has been phenomenal considering his little time in the car. I also do think maybe highlights that the V-Carb is, one, a very good midfield car, but secondly, quite an easy to drive midfield car, just with the fact that we know Lawson's been phenomenal in it all season. Arvid was still being very good, and then Yuki's able to jump in, and it was not a real struggle for him. I do think that says something about the drivability of that car, which obviously is a good thing, but I do think it maybe makes both Lawson's season so far and Arvid's season so far as well maybe a little less impressive to me. I don't know, maybe I'll see how I feel about that as the season continues to progress, but I definitely do think that raises more questions for me about just how impressive their driving has been. Next up we have Haas, and we're going to start with Esteban Ocon, who I'm giving a 7.5 out of 10. Ocon qualified 15th in the sprint, finished 14th, and then in the main race qualified 15th and did not finish. A really unfortunate end to the weekend for Esteban, because I actually think he was driving very well, considering again the Haas is not a good car. At this point I think it is abundantly clear that car is not good at all, and I think he did a good job, was well ahead of Behrman this weekend again, and we'll get to that more when we talk about Ollie. Really unfortunate to have had just car problems end his race, because I do think he was doing a pretty good job. Obviously not near the points. Haas, that just is not on the cards for them anytime soon now, but otherwise I think some good driving from Esteban. Next up we have Ollie Behrman, who I'm giving a 4.5 out of 10. In the sprint, qualified 17th, finished 15th, and in the main race qualified 20th and did not finish. Another weekend that was an absolute nightmare for Ollie Behrman. Obviously he did not have a good time out in Hungary, but I was hoping that the summer break would mean that this wouldn't continue for him, but unfortunately it has. I really hope that this doesn't become a problem extending further into the season for Ollie, because he was way off Esteban Ocon all weekend, and then again car problems ended his race. Very unfortunate there, but even if he had finished this race I don't think he would have achieved much, to be honest. He just did not have pace really at all. Next up we have Red Bull. I'm going to start with Liam Lawson. I'm giving a 7.5 out of 10. In the sprint he qualified 11th and finished 11th, and in the main race he qualified 8th and finished 7th. I think Liam did a good job considering being thrown into the Red Bull, which we've seen has been quite a handful to drive this season. In the sprint, I would have preferred him to get up into the top 10, but I'm not super upset about him not quite making it. And then obviously he improved into main qualifying, qualified behind Max. I will say he was a 10th and a half down, so that is still a decent gap, but it's not horrific, and I think again considering how little time he's had in that car is a good qualifying. And then in the main race just had a very lonely drive, obviously gained a position because of Max DNFing, which we'll talk about, but otherwise it was not super impressive. I think that's where that car should be, so I think Liam's just kind of driven it to where it should be. I will say he nearly took out Max in the opening lap. That wheel-to-wheel driving, I did not understand what those two thought they were doing, but yeah, I think it was a decent weekend from Liam Lawson. I don't think it's one of his more impressive drives of the season, but I think he drove the car where it needed to be. So next up we have Max Verstappen. This is a tough one for me this weekend. I have to give Max a 4 out of 10, which I think that's the first time I've ever given him below a 5, maybe even below a 6. I really don't want to have to do this. I'm sure some people say that a 4 is too generous, but I will explain. But anyway, he qualified 6th, finished 6th in the sprint, and obviously in the main race qualified 7th and did not finish. In the sprint, I think that's where the Red Bull should be. If anything, it's a position higher than I expect it to be. I think Hamilton just absolutely fucked it in sprint qualifying, so I think Max was a beneficiary there. And then in the main race, I feel like I need to break down the entirety of the single lap Max drove, because it felt like he was just in the wars the entire time. He got a really good launch on the start, which is even more frustrating because then he was shoved into the grass by Lewis Hamilton, which I do think becomes important when we talk about his crash, because then he's wheel-to-wheel with Liam, they wheel bang, they are fighting out, he manages to keep himself ahead of Liam, and then heading into the final turn just hits the paint and it's still damp, and spins out the car, and you know, once you hit a damp spot like that and the rear goes, you know, you're a passenger at that point. And it's really unfortunate for Max. I will say, like, it's definitely driver error. It's why I've rated him so low versus some of his other DNFs this season, which have been due to the car. But I do think, like, part of the problem with the crash is also that because of him being pushed onto the grass at the beginning of the lap, like, his left tyres also had less grip because they were dirty, like there was like mud on them. So he had less grip on the left side, and then hit that damp patch with the front right. You know, just misjudged it. He said like he thought he had a dry patch there and he just accelerated too early and that was it. Yeah, it's an unfortunate mistake. I think we often treat Max like he can't make mistakes in the car, and this is certainly, I think, a very minor mistake. It just had massive consequences for him. I think the really unfortunate thing is obviously this being his final home Grand Prix, with Zandvoort not returning to the calendar next year and seemingly not for a while at least. But I don't think it's the absolute worst, and I really don't think he would have gained many points if he'd stayed in this race. Obviously points would have been good, but clearly the Red Bull was a very slow car, so I'm not as upset as I think I would have been if Max was further up the grid. But yeah, it's an unfortunate mistake that's had massive consequences for him, but I'm surprisingly less upset than I thought I'd be. I think I'm still, the most upset I've been this season probably was the Silverstone crash or the Monaco start, but we'll move on to McLaren. Starting with Oscar Piastri, I'm giving a 7 out of 10 in the sprint. Oscar qualified 4th and finished 5th, and then in the main race, qualified 4th, finished 6th. I had a really tough time rating Oscar Piastri for this weekend because the sprint was fine. Like, the sprint's kind of where I expect the McLaren to be, so I'm not really thinking about that too much here. But I find his main race really difficult to rate because McLaren made a series of the weirdest, most baffling choices with Oscar Piastri's car this weekend that I really have no fucking understanding of what they were thinking. Like, first of all, starts on the mediums. Okay, starts the same strategy as Lando, that's fine. Then obviously we had the red flag because of Max. Why, for the standing start, would we put Oscar Piastri on the hard tyre when we know everyone else around is going to be on softs or mediums, because we know that the tyre deck has been very low all weekend? So I have no understanding of that from McLaren. Yet somehow he managed to gain a place of that start because of George having deployment issues. So, you know, that ended up being far more positive, I think, of a start than I thought it would be for Oscar. But then after, I've brought up the pit summary actually to talk about Oscar. So then after that, let's see, George Russell pits on lap 17, which makes sense because at that point he was on either the softs or the mediums, I can't quite remember. But they then decide to pit Oscar a lap after George, even though he's on the hards, and they pit him for another set of hard tyres that he's only been driving on for like 15 laps. I have no understanding as to why they thought that was a good idea. And that only begins the chain reaction of poor things that happen to Oscar Piastri. He also has a slow pit stop in there, and then they weirdly try to put him on a similar strategy to Lando later on in the race. Like, I don't understand this, because he pits firstly lap 18 for the second set of hards, and then he pits again on lap 44, which is only 3 laps before Lando's final stop for the soft tyres. But so the soft tyre stint ends up being longer than both of Oscar's hard tyre stints, which makes, again, no sense. It's just a series of truly baffling choices from McLaren that makes it really difficult to rate Oscar's actual driving, because the strategy is so unbelievably shit that I don't even know how to really describe my feelings. The whole race, I just felt like every time they cut to Oscar, I was confused for a new reason. And so for that reason, like, I've given Oscar a 7 because I think he did a decent drive, but it's also hard to tell because I think it looks worse than his driving was because McLaren absolutely fucked the strategy. Next up is Lando Norris, so I'm giving a 9.5 out of 10. In the sprint, Lando qualified second, finished third. In the main race, he qualified first, finished first. This was a phenomenal weekend from Lando Norris. I would give him a 10, like I'm so tempted to still give him a 10, but I do think losing a position in the sprint is unfortunate, and I also think losing the lead to Kimi on the second start is also unfortunate. But other than those two really minor mistakes, which I honestly might not even end up taking into account, I might still give him a 10. But other than those, I really do think this was a phenomenal drive from Lando Norris. I think his pace was fantastic. I'm glad to see McLaren didn't plague him with the same strategy blunders as they did his teammate. And then, yeah, Lando was just so fast. Even in that opening stint where, you know, I kind of assumed if Kimi got the lead, he would really run off with it. But Lando stayed with Kimi the whole way through. He was just fantastic on his tyres, fantastic on pace. And then that final overtake to secure the lead was perfect driving from Lando Norris. I feel like we're watching a very new driver when we watch Lando this season compared to last. I feel like he always had moments of this, but it feels like now he is a really fully realised driver. He's confident in his skills, because to pull off an overtake like he did on Kimi and Lewis requires such confidence in both yourself and your car, and I think he absolutely had that, and it was truly a perfect move. And I think it just was the end of a really, really great weekend for Lando, and I'm very happy to see this from him. Next up we have Ferrari. I'm going to start with Lewis Hamilton, who in the sprint qualified 7th, finished 7th, and in the main race qualified 5th, finished 4th. Starting with the sprint, I think Lewis was pretty fucking mediocre in the sprint, to be honest. I think qualifying behind Max and the Red Bull that looked visibly very slow this weekend is already not great, and not even really being able to attempt the overtake on Max, considering his teammate was able to overtake during the sprint and was the only one to really do an overtake in the sprint. And then the main race, again, a really hard one to grade, which is why I've given Lewis a 7, because for similar reasons as Oscar Piastri, Ferrari have made a series of choices in this race that I don't even think I can explain here, because I don't still fully understand what they were doing with either of their cars. I get them trying to leave Lewis out for longer in the first stint. I think that's fair enough. Try and get the tyre offset to Norris and Antonelli. But then I don't really understand this strategy of... As you can tell, I'm speechless trying to talk about this because I'm trying to grasp in my head what they were doing. But to then pit Lewis and have him behind Charles being like, okay, I'm faster, let me go. They're not having the correct communication with their drivers is the issue. Like, I have looked at their radios a bit, and they're essentially giving Charles and Lewis like counterintuitive instructions to one another. So Lewis is begging to be let past Charles. Meanwhile, Charles is begging not to pit yet because he thinks he can stay out a little longer. But they're also not telling Charles to let Lewis pass. So then it ends up slowing Lewis down on the opening of that stint. And then they only left Charles out for one more lap than they originally wanted him to stay out for, even though he was asking for longer. So he ended up having both of their drivers being very unhappy. At one point, Charles was just yelling at the team in Italian, and that is the angriest Lewis Hamilton radio I've heard in a while, maybe ever, honestly. And it just is a fucking disaster. Like, neither of your drivers are happy. You haven't chosen a strategy that either of them think works, and you've managed to have them both lose time and possible positions. It's so baffling to me, and so it makes it, again, really hard to rate Lewis's driving because the strategy is so poor. So moving on to Charles Leclerc, I'm giving him a 7.5 out of 10, really solely because I think in the sprint he was significantly better. You know, qualified third, finished second in the sprint, and then the main race qualified sixth, finished fifth. I think it was a really good sprint from Charles. I think third is honestly a higher qualifying than I think that Ferrari should be around Zandvoort, and then managing the overtake on Lando and making the soft tyres last for the whole sprint. It was a really, really good job, and that's why he does get 0.5 higher than Lewis for me. And then in the main race, I again do think he was the better Ferrari, minus I think the pace in that middle stint, but I also think that's hard to tell because of the tyre offset. But again, the strategy is so weird and it doesn't make sense, and it leads to, again, both their drivers being so unhappy and time loss and position losses. It's just a fucking joke. I honestly think Ferrari are lucky that McLaren made such massive mistakes with Oscar Piastri, because I do think they could have been under even more threat, both if Max had stayed in the race and if Oscar had strategy that made sense. And finally, we have to talk about Mercedes, starting with Kimi Antonelli, who I'm giving an 8 out of 10. He qualified 5th in the sprint and finished 4th. And then for the main race, qualified 3rd, finished 2nd. I think this was still a good weekend from Kimi Antonelli. I do, however, think the sprint was quite weak, especially in comparison to his teammate who managed to keep it up in first. You know, qualified a really phenomenal qualifying lap from George in the sprint, which we'll talk about. And then, yeah, just Kimi was nowhere near George's pace. Obviously, nearly crashed himself out at the very beginning of sprint qualifying. He is so lucky there. And then in the main race, I think his race pace was very good. I really do think on race pace, Kimi and Lando were in a class of their own during this race. However, I do have serious issues with the late teammate swap. That's my main point of contention with Mercedes this weekend. Because I think Kimi drove a good race. I don't think it was one of his best. I don't think it was a super special drive. I think he just did a good job with the Mercedes, which we know is very good. But I think that Mercedes swapping George and Kimi, more than anything else to me, feels like they are protecting Kimi from his poor racecraft. I don't think we've seen great racecraft from Kimi often, really, if at all. I think Canada, he did have good racecraft, but in him and George, I don't know, I think that's more of they were purposely leaving space because they're teammates. I don't know if I trust that Kimi would do that with other drivers. We've seen him, especially last season, take out a lot of drivers because of poor racecraft. And while I know that he is a different driver this season, certainly a better one, it does feel like inverting them more than anything else shows a real lack of trust from Mercedes in Kimi Antonelli's defensive driving from Lewis Hamilton, but also his attacking driving on George Russell. It means he's not forced to commit the overtake on George, which I do think wouldn't have been all that difficult because of the massive tyre offset. Because even though obviously this is a difficult track to overtake at, we did see several overtakes in this race. It was not impossible, and I think the offset was great enough that Kimi should have been able to make that move on his own. So I think they didn't trust him to fight George, and they did not trust him to defend against Lewis. And I think that more than anything highlights a weakness of his title challenge, because part of winning the world title is racecraft, and it feels like Mercedes helped Kimi essentially avoid any sort of real wheel-to-wheel racing in the final stint. And now, last but certainly not least, moving on to George Russell, I'm giving a 9 out of 10. I consider whether this was a little high and I should give him the 8.5, but actually, no, I think George did a good job this weekend. So, obviously, in the sprint, qualified first, finished first, and then the main race, qualified second, finished third. I think it was a phenomenal sprint from George Russell. I think this weekend has been maybe the most comfortable I've seen him look in the car since Australia, honestly. I think he was really in tune with the car, especially during the sprint. A very good job from him there. Then in the race, I think qualifying was fine. I think George being second in main qualifying is more due to Lando putting together a phenomenal lap versus George putting together a poor one. And then obviously the race start wasn't great, and then on the second race start he had the deployment issue that caused Oscar to pass him. So those are obviously minor issues, but other than that I don't think George Russell really did anything wrong in this race, apart from letting Kimi Antonelli pass him. Which, like, maybe I should rate him lower for that choice, but I think George just doesn't want to argue within the team, which I think is fair. But I'm frustrated that, like, the strategy he was on did put him at more risk than Kimi in the final stint, because he was on those old hard tyres. And so I think George offered to work as a team to protect the double podium for both of them, because ultimately, like, more than fighting each other right now, they also both need to defend from losing points to Lewis Hamilton. And I think George offered the team orders, I'm sure partially out of self-interest, thinking that, like, oh, they'll keep it, so I'll stay second, I'll gain a couple points on Kimi. I really do think more than anything George was thinking that, like, that would be the only way to retain the double podium. You know, and he did ask, like, is Kimi still challenging for the win? You know, he was willing to obviously let Kimi go if he was still challenging, which is, I think, far more fair than Kimi deserves as the championship leader and George's main rival. But for Mercedes to then take George's offer of teamwork to protect the double podium and instead turn it on him and ask him to give up the position to Kimi is absolutely laughable. And the fact that he did it, I think, sucks. I get he's clearly trying to just not get into trouble with Mercedes, and I do feel like they keep such a tight leash on their drivers, but it's ridiculous to give up position to your championship rival who is pretty significantly ahead of you in points. It's not like the McLaren situation last year either, where Lando and Oscar at least were close. So when the swap was asked for in Monza, it wasn't quite as, I think, insane to ask, even though I still think that was ridiculous from McLaren last season. But for Mercedes to have asked this from George Russell is an absolute joke. It really, for me, sours Kimi's spot on the podium here, because I think he would not have been able to defend against Lewis Hamilton all that effectively. I think Mercedes have tried to protect Kimi here, and they've thrown George to the wolves, which is ridiculous. Like, it's very clear who they want to win this title, and, you know, even post-race, it's abundantly clear that Mercedes and Toto Wolff did not think that George would be able to defend that position. So you know, they've knowingly left him out to dry, and I think George put together a defensive masterclass to maintain that podium for himself. And I'm actually so glad he did, because he did put together a really good race. And the fact that he nearly lost the podium because of Mercedes' pretty blatant favoritism, I'll just say it, is really frustrating. But I am glad he managed to defend that podium at the very least. But yeah, that is all for my driver ratings for the Dutch Grand Prix. I feel like I've been talking for so long about this one. A crazy race after I thought we were going to get a very boring one. Obviously not the most positive race for me personally, considering my driver fucking crashed on lap 1, but otherwise a very entertaining race. I think gave us a lot to talk about, especially I think concerning team dynamics after some of what we saw this race. But yeah, if you liked this video, please hit the like button, and if you would like to see even more from me, please subscribe. And if you would like to see even more from me, you can follow me on Instagram, TikTok, Letterboxd, all those things are linked down below. And those places you can see more of what I'm up to, my makeup and special effects work, and also my movie opinions, which there is also film commentary on this channel if you want to look at that as well. Also, I've been actually remembering to post on TikTok more lately, so it's actually worth going there now. But yeah, other than that, thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next video. Bye.